Today's episode of The Bluff is sponsored by SitRep. SitRep is an notorious open source intelligent app that provides the latest updates for over 180 countries and over 500 topics, allowing you to stay ahead and informed. Now available on Apple and Google. Thank you, SitRep, for sponsoring this episode.
Welcome back to the Bottom Line Up Front, an Artorias podcast. I'm Matt.
And I'm Stefano, the Chief Intelligence Officer of Artorias. And today we are joined by Roger Ford, the President of Eureka Energy Corporation. Thank you so much for joining us, Roger. Please, for our listeners, if you want to give a quick introduction in who you are, because the topic we're going to cover today, I think, is very important.
Yeah, Roger Ford, President of Eureka Energy Corporation. Eureka is incorporated in the state of Wyoming. I'm actually born and raised in the state of Kentucky. It's where I reside right now, and have been involved in economic development, energy development for the better part of my career, spanning about 20, 25 years, actually, in this sector. And I have a master's in national security. I did my master's thesis on threats to the national power grid, actually, was the subject of my thesis. And I have a keen interest in the way our policies and the way the country as a whole is responding to new energy demand, new uses of energy, new energy technologies, and those types of things. And I get up every day thinking about that, and how we can better secure our grid and our energy infrastructure in the country, and how we do that from resource management and allocation to actual hardening of assets against both physical and cyber threats. So I think we're kind of all aligned in that conversation, and I'm happy to be with you today.
Well, Roger, thank you so much for joining us. We're very excited about this. And I think what you said, literally everything you're focusing on and all the different topics is exactly what this episode about, because energy security is national security, and it also has broad economic and geopolitical implications. And in this episode, we really wanted to focus on that specific topic related to the United States and that area of expertise that you have. And so kind of the first question that I'll ask you to kind of start this episode is, you know, we've seen with the second Trump administration coming into office, we're seeing a huge push in oil and gas. I mean, obviously the political term drill, baby, drill. We have seen, and, you know, from the beginning, if we were analyzing it from the beginning of the 21st century to now, this concern of, you know, the United States having oil scarcity now, in many instances, even exporting more oil than any other country in the world. And so my question for you, specifically in the last, you know, let's analyze this from the last 10 months since President Trump came into office. What are the wins and the concerns that you have related to American energy security and energy political development within this country?
Well, let's look at really the reality of what his energy agenda is currently, as I see it. And I've kind of made some bullet points to kind of guide our conversation. Uh, I think he correctly determines that we need a push for deregulation. I think he correctly gets it right in expansion of fossil fuel production and reopening federal lands for development. I think, you know, the idea of a National Energy Dominance Council, where basically it's a whole of government approach behind the fossil fuels, nuclear energy, and permitting reform, is a good step to coordinate the actions and reactions of the federal government. Exporting more natural gas or LNG, I think, has been a positive thing. I think, I'm in coal country. I think revitalizing at some level the coal industry, giving some relief, extending plant life, these types of things, that sunset regulations. Unfortunately, there are some negatives to that, and I see the weaknesses kind of coinciding with some of the positives. I'm, as somebody in the kind of alternative and renewable space and development solar and battery storage projects and bioenergy projects, especially. I advocate kind of an all of the above approach. And I think we've kind of overcorrected against renewables. We're constantly in this struggle where it's pushing this concept of an either or paradigm. And I'm not necessarily in that camp. I don't see energy as having to choose between fossil fuels or renewables. I think that these resources need to complement each other, and we need to figure out how we work together. Again, that would be a true all of the above approach. So there's been an overcorrection in the big beautiful bill, especially that's sunsetting a lot of incentives and a lot of credits for renewables. I actually wrote an op-ed in the Lexington Herald Leader and have written about this action that was taken back in the summer, and pointed out that there's reports out there where the investment by the Biden administration in renewables and their infrastructure act, actually the investment was by 87% or better going into red congressional districts. So actually Republican districts are benefiting from the investments being made in the private sector for renewable energy. They were benefiting rural areas that had voted for Trump in 2024, had voted for Trump in 2020, and in 2016. These were Republican areas. And so this bill actually has harmed private investment going into those congressional districts. I think it's kind of wrong-headed, right? You cut your nose off to spite your face, as they say, in that. So I think there's been an overcorrection against renewables. I think even though I'm in coal country, I think there's a little bit of a coal-centric tilt that kind of creates a whiplash in terms of investment in other sectors. I think it creates a longer commitment to coal-fired generation than probably should be. And this, again, gets back to grid resilience and transitioning to other forms of base load power. So there are some, domestic problems with this. I think that there's some international risk in terms of some of our allies in Europe with, especially on carbon emissions, whether we understand that or not. The European Union passes these carbon border tariffs that can hurt our exports. So it makes us globally uncompetitive economically on manufactured goods and services here that are being sent to Europe and other places who are still adhering to the Paris Accords and these things. So it ripples through our economy on some of these gaps that Trump's initiatives have created. So I think we need to kind of revisit those as we go forward, and how we correct maybe and straighten that up to bring it back to the middle in terms of resource allocation, in terms of the types of energy we're using.
So when we're talking about the renewable energies, I guess specifically, is your concern, because we've heard this before, right? If we're looking at the Biden administration with the Green New, with the infrastructure bill specifically,
yeah,
I mean, the argument was that it would help the United States to rebuild or build from the beginning kind of our renewable energy infrastructure so that we can be a producer and even, ideally an exporter of, let's say, for example, solar panels, right? That we've seen a huge growth of that used across the United States because of the concern that right now China basically dominated that. And again, that has economic and geopolitical implications. Is your concern with kind of this overcorrection that we are ceding ground in that important, industry to the Chinese related to other countries around the world in the renewable energy sector?
Yeah, that's exactly my chief concern. Obviously, the opposition will say, well, we've got homegrown energy. We've got coal, we've got oil, we've got natural gas. To a certain extent, we've got hydro. Well, that's great, right? That's great that we have all that. However, there's a whole space out there uh, in the global economy where solar panels are being fabricated and all the equipment for those solar farms are being manufactured in China, and they're dominating and have dominated that market for a while. Uh, just because we're not white hot focused on renewables in the United States at the moment doesn't mean that the rest of the world is not. So, discouraging uh, investment, I can understand importation of Chinese equipment, but we need to foster our own manufacturing base to create a export of these products in the United States, or at least in North America and in Europe, um, to compete with what the Chinese are doing. So taking our eye off the renewable ball, uh, seeds ground to the Chinese in manufacturing. That's that's where my chief concern lies. We've allowed the Chinese to become the world's manufacturer, quite frankly, across the board, not just in the energy sector, but in practically everything that we do, right? And so it kind of goes hand in glove. Um, we need to focus on shoring of our manufacturing of these components. We need to ramp up the extraction and how we procure rare earth elements and things like graphene. All of these things play to a high tech, sophisticated future that we're definitely going to be in, unless something catastrophic happens. And so I think the policies, while focusing on our domestic resources, we need to be dedicating some time to think about reviving our manufacturing and promoting and incentivizing our manufacturing of these, these products at home and incentivizing the use of those products. We're working on a project specifically right now in Texas, and are having a conversation with a solar company in California and thinking about how we kind of create our own supply chain by manufacturing these panels in the United States. So we procure that for an American made enterprise in Texas, and how that what that might look like. And I think that's how we need to be thinking. And I don't know that policy is properly addressing that right now.
You also mentioned how important it is to diversify using a variety of energy sources. So one of the things that first comes to mind for me is during the initial full-scale invasion of Ukraine, we saw just how vulnerable Europe was, considering they relied so much on Russian gas pipelines. So, could you talk a little bit more about the importance of diversification and what that means to you, and especially through that security lens, as well as what do you think are the most plausible energy shock scenarios that the United States might see in the next decade or so?
Yeah, I think in a lot of ways we're seeing, if you look at an historical comparison, I think what we're seeing in Ukraine is similar to what we saw in Spain during the Spanish Civil War. I think it's a dress rehearsal for the next big global conflict, potentially, if you want to draw a historical comparison. And what you've seen in Ukraine, and I have friends in Ukraine, I have business associates in Ukraine, and what they have faced is what we potentially could face if we were in a larger global conflict with the Chinese and the Russians, which is they have these massive power plants which have been easily attacked repeatedly by the Russians, and it puts the power out all over the country. That could happen to us because we have a very centralized grid and a large, set of generation of massive power plants. and it makes for an easy target. And I don't know that we're properly prepared for uh, a potential conflict that would target our infrastructure, that would put out our ability to produce power over large segments of the country and millions of people being in the dark for days on end. Uh, it also puts other things in the dark, like our ability to pump natural gas and to pump fuel, to provide medical services. I mean, it just kind of dominoes, right? So, looking at Ukraine and their over reliance on, and Europe as a whole on Russian natural gas, has exposed a very weak spot. So I understand the idea of what Trump is saying in terms of we need to be energy secure in our resource, but being energy secure is more than just producing more oil for ourselves, more gas for ourselves, more uh, buying more coal for ourselves, and it requires like a real dedication to a new strategy in terms of decentralizing our power generation. So I'm a big proponent of what I call energy citadels or islanded power generation. So looking at down to the county city level, where you have especially critical manufacturing of building power uh, distribution just for that city, just for that manufacturing set of facilities, so that if something does happen and there is a cyber or physical attack, you don't run the risk of a couple of EMPs putting out power for a third or fourth of the country and millions of people being in the dark, and then we have no ability to really function not just as a military but as an economy. So having islanded power that's layered on top of our existing power grid, I think, is a smart move. Yeah, it's extra investment, but I think the opportunities are there, and it protects us against these threats by being able to bring that power generation back online more quickly. But again, we have to manufacture the components here, and the idea is of adding this as far as renewables to our existing fossil fuel mix. I think helps us conserve. I mean, the idea of conservation shouldn't be uh, a danger word to conservatives, to Republicans, as I am. I'm a conservative, but I look at it from a conservation standpoint that if I'm using these other types of energy, I'm conserving and making last longer my fossil fuels, which are important. So the proper mix helps both provide security, but it also provides longevity to your natural resources.
So when looking at the grid, and you already mentioned this as well,
Mm-hmm.
one of the things is hardening some of the critical infrastructure, hardening those as targets. But we've also seen beyond those physical attacks, like we saw in Moore County in the substation attack in 2022, we also saw uh, the ransomware attack on the Colonial Pipeline, as well
Mm-hmm.
as an incident where Iran was able to gain access to the control system at the Bowman Ave Dam in Rye, New York. In both those cases, it wasn't necessarily the physical infrastructure. Those came from cyber attacks. And so when discussing both the hardening of the physical targets, but also their sort of cyber profile, is that something that you're also focusing on?
Yeah, actually, that is a key thing, and we want to attach labels to these bad actors of who would attack physically, especially, but by we can understand who the players are when it comes to a cyber attack, to a hacking situation. But like you mentioned, the North Carolina incident, especially. That was a far right fringe element. It wasn't an Islamic terrorist group. It wasn't Antifa. It wasn't one of these groups. It was, a white nationalist group, basically, and that wants to somehow accelerate the collapse of society. you know, I think we can't get too fixated on the origin of the radicalism. We have to just recognize there's multiple types of radicalism that all kind of converge on a single point, which is to wreak chaos and havoc. Um, but in terms of what we're doing in terms of construction, because our project focus is now and will be in the future creating these energy citadels that is building dedicated power for data centers in the artificial intelligence space and for advanced materials manufacturing. I think it's important to have dedicated power, and that's kind of where our focus is going to be in terms of our development as a company. A critical part of that is working with companies such as Artorias and so forth on the security aspect that has to be applied to these facilities. And I think how artificial intelligence works within that of being able to be responsive in an instant, right, as threats arise, or predictive security even has to be built into our development strategy going forward. So I think AI plays a significant part in that, to identify threats, both physical and on the technology side, and how that can be applied in our development as we bring these facilities online, I think is a critical point. And for any corporation, whether that's an auto manufacturer or a pharmaceutical company or whatever that is, I think they need to, if they are not thinking about it, they need to really get focused on how AI can help them in their security for their respective industries. I just think it is the world we live in, and that has to be a part of the conversation going forward.
So when we're analyzing kind of the threat to the grid, I mean, I kind of want to go to kind of specifics. I mean, in
Yes.
your perspective, Roger, who would you view as the greatest threat to U.S. energy infrastructure? Would it be the Chinese? Would it be the Russians? And maybe it's the Chinese, for example, but is there one actor that maybe is not the greatest threat, but you think is not getting enough attention and deserves much more attention because they're really prodding into our grid systems and really trying to cripple us?
I think it's a combination. If I'm not going to duck the question. I think it's kind of congealing around a coalitional kind of threat. I look at China as the finance, Russia as kind of the muscle, and then you have the kind of narco terror state, with Iran and the drug cartels and they kind of all are kind of congealing around a coordination strategy. But at the end of the day, I think that the Chinese are the drivers in that competition, in that threat. So I would place the concern mainly with the Chinese. I mean, there's other players out there, but I think the Chinese are our biggest long-term competitive threat out there. And that's, I think we're seeing policymakers in the defense sector kind of recognizing this. I think the efforts to build coalitional groups in the Pacific region, especially, and strengthen our ties with Japan and Australia and the Philippines and Taiwan and these countries. I think they're recognizing that China is kind of the next kind of battlefield, and I think they're the driver in this group of entities, countries, and actors out here that pose a threat in one way or another to us. And so, it becomes a kind of a hard thing to peg, but I think it begins with the Chinese.
Now, because we're talking about the kind of the cybersecurity dimension
Mm-hmm.
to the grid. I guess, though, one of the other areas of kind of concerns that you kind of hear from U.S. policymakers, and I think, one of the areas that people look at is like when we're talking about the Chinese, this predominance that the Chinese like to buy, let's say, land near, sensitive military infrastructure, and also obviously the concern of the presence in the United States from a counterintelligence and how they leverage that. I guess the question that I have for you, I mean, I think it's very well known, the Chinese and the Russians, kind of their cybersecurity threat and their hacking abilities against U.S. grid infrastructure and how hard it is to defeat that. But my question to you is, what about from the other angle of leveraging just economic policies to try to gain monopoly over natural resources, or as we alluded to in the beginning, kind of how the Chinese are trying to be the leaders in renewable energies? Do you know like a specific examples or case studies or kind of broadly, and how the Chinese might be trying to choke the U.S. out from kind of energy policy, either being natural resources or kind of the renewable energy, both in the United States or maybe just internationally?
I think you have to look to the rare earth element uh, uh, arena for how they're trying to do that. From what I've read and what I understand, they are obviously the dominant uh, producer of those resources, and those are vital to not just our technological systems, but our military technology, our space and aeronautic uh, industries. Um, and they want to dominate that, and I think that's what they're trying to do all over the world. I think that's why they're really focused on uh, places globally like Africa from a geopolitical standpoint. Why are they, focused on West Africa, and why are they building dual use port facilities on the western side of the continent of Africa to project power into the Atlantic Ocean? I think that's to pose us direct threat to get in our right in our backyard. But the rare earth elements, they're on the hunt for resources. They need resources. They want to dominate not just resources within their region, but I think their idea is to deny us resources, or to require us, or to force us into having to depend on them for the resources. Um, and that's of a chief concern to me, you know, uh, because those elemental pieces are essential for a wide variety of advanced manufacturing and technology. And so we have to really address that. I think the president's, trying to make an effort to do that. But again, that goes back to some of these elements are integral in the renewable space. So if we can't access those, we don't produce the best quality solar panels or the best quality switch gears or whatever that is in the power space. So I think you have to follow what they're doing in the rare earth element uh, sector, especially of securing rights to mine and extract these minerals, especially in areas of the world like Africa. And you mentioned they're purchasing land. I know there's beginning to be some pushback on that. I read the other day they purchased a trailer park. A Chinese company purchased a trailer park near a U.S. military base. Uh, May have been Missouri. And I'm like, really, the Chinese government wants to invest in mobile homes, uh, residential housing in the United States. I mean, how transparent can you be as to what your real purpose is? You want to be near the military base where the B 2 bomber is. So, I mean, it's some of it's kind of funny, just the fact that they don't really try to conceal it, but you have to pay attention to those things. But I think we need to really tighten up their ability to purchase land near military bases and what they're doing with that land once they have purchased it, and be watchful of that, because you really don't know at this point what their full intention is.
And I think that that's similar to what we've seen in the cyberspace as well, as in it is somewhat prepositioning. So we know that they are trying to access and conduct recon on the US infrastructure on the cyber front, but buying land near military bases or critical infrastructure is similar in that at the moment it poses a threat, maybe not a direct threat, but it's not offensive by nature necessarily. But you did mention talking about these rare earth elements and some of the activities that we see China partaking in Africa and gaining access to mining rights, or in some cases, sponsoring and funding illegal mining operations. We see that also with things like gold or fishing. And so that is where I think the United States is maybe taking a step back from the world stage. And that is a sort of soft power that we're not seeing a high level of importance placed by the Trump administration. So, do you have any sort of advice or what that would look like in an ideal world, how the United States would go about combating that and combating China's presence in these areas?
I know there were abuses with the USAID and the foreign aid is a real sore spot for a lot of people uh, in in the Make America Great movement. Um, I sympathize with some of that. I think that there was actually too much kind of carte blanche, kind of just here's you some money, let's go with it. Uh, which opens up potential for a lot of fraud. However, uh, I think simply ending foreign aid and completely severing that kind of ties one arm behind our back as a country in terms of being economically competitive or kind of winning friends and influencing people. Um, I think there has to be a reconsideration of that. And I think we have to get back in that game because and rethink how we award foreign aid, how we spend foreign aid, and how that's done as a country. I think is the thing. Um, so yeah, I see us losing out because the Chinese are just showing up with bundles of cash and they're just basically buying it, and there's nobody there competing for the business, right, for these countries. So they're able to go in and just basically, without much effort, secure, commitments from lesser developed countries to buy the rights to their resources. Um, and we've got to get in that game because it's critical that we compete. Um, how we, properly spend tax dollars in that, I think, is important. But we have to reconsider our position in this and do so very soon, in my opinion.
And do you think that a way, Roger, for that to be achieved then is, do you think there should be, because we're seeing with the Trump administration, like for example, buying 10% of Intel, the major U.S. corporation, we're seeing kind of this push in kind of some of these semiconductor businesses, et cetera, where there's kind of much more government, let's say, involvement. Do you think that this is an area where there should be much more government approach, maybe much more U.S. Diplomatic support? That this is something that maybe private corporations on their own can't handle because they're fighting basically, let's say, the weight of the Chinese Communist Party that has the whole of government and whole of economy into this effort. Do you think the United States needs to take a similar approach, or do you still believe that maybe this should be private sector led, that there's more capabilities doing it that way rather than, let's say, government bureaucracy and inefficiency?
I think it still has to be a private market approach. I think it's a private market solution, but I think they have to be backed up strongly by the federal government. That we can't have corporations worrying that the U.S. government is not going to have a U.S. corporations back. That if they are looking to take care of us, we take care of them. You know, so yeah, I mean, we're at a disadvantage again. Back to the idea of the CCP basically calls the tune and they decide what they want to do, and it's kind of a top down hybrid of the command and control economy because they decide what the next 5 year plan, 10 year plan is going to be. I read an interesting book here a few years ago. It's by Michael Pillsbury. It's a 100 year marathon, and it's a very good book in terms of laying out kind of the Chinese vision for the next 100 years, the race they intend to win. And a lot of these subjects are covered in that book. And so I would recommend it to anybody that kind of wants to understand the mind of the Chinese of kind of where they're going and what's leading their thinking and their thought process. But we have to, especially in these critical sectors, in terms of energy, high tech, semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, even. There's a role for the government to play if it's a stockholder, to where it puts up some protections because of the vital nature of the industry. So be it. I would like to see any profits derived from that laid into a fund and not wasted or put back in, by the government to provide some security for those industries at some level. But I think we have to really get back into the game of foreign aid and investment in countries to remain economically competitive in the global market, for sure.
So, Roger, we do want to ask a question about data centers, but actually, something you mentioned there about kind of foreign aid and kind of bringing that back. Let me ask you a specific question about our allies, and let's focus on, let's say, the Europeans, Japan, South Korea. Is this something where, just as you alluded to, kind of this coalition for our adversaries, is this a scenario where you can see there's a lot of synergy and concurrence between European efforts and American efforts, and let's say our allies in the Pacific? And this is a prime opportunity to kind of create a coalition of the willing within the energy sector? Or is this more of a scenario where kind of all great powers are going to try to compete against one and the other to fight to this resources? Where will you lie on that?
The great power competition where everybody's working against everybody else, I think, leads to conflicts. For all of our disagreements, I think our allies are our allies. I think you have the Israelis. I think you have the European countries for the most part. Obviously, in the Pacific Rim, you have the South Koreans, the Japanese, Taiwanese, the Australians, the New Zealanders. All those countries. Right? We could name them all. I lean into at some level, we're going to have disagreements, but I think in critical areas, I think there is a paradigm where we can regionally partner and allocate and create and share in the benefits of, onshore semiconductor manufacturing, because all these countries have certain areas where they're experts, right? Koreans shipbuilding and, the Japanese, and they all have, certain strengths, just like we do. And amongst our allies, that core group, I think we have to align ourselves more collectively in terms of economic strategy and development, especially among the critical resources and how that's done. And I think for the benefit of everybody, because I think that's exactly what the Chinese are trying to do. It's just for the benefit of the Chinese. But they're going to allocate that, with the Russians or the Iranians or whoever, for their benefit. I think we need to adopt a similar strategy or figure out how we do that. Because I think if we try to go this idea of going it alone, that if we just would, become strictly isolationist, withdraw all of our support from NATO and pull back, and we just take care of America first. These European countries, these Pacific Rim countries, they're going to get together and they're going to figure out how they take care of themselves, and we're going to be alone in the world. And I think it alone doesn't quite work uh, the way it used to. I think it's a noble idea to think, oh well, we're strong and we can be independent of any entangling alliances that they like to talk about. But I think at some level we're interconnected because we have a lot of shared values. And I think to face the threat from China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, the terror groups, and the drug cartels, I think we're going to have to be united in several areas, energy being one of those.
Actually, it's very interesting, Roger, where you kind of said this because we had an episode recently that we published, and we were kind of analyzing, this what would be the Trump doctrine, right? And 2.0, right? I think everybody kind of throws the America first, but one of the aspects that I think is not getting enough attention when we're analyzing kind of the Trump doctrine and the foreign policy, and what I'm starting to notice is this idea of a much more, in broad sense, economic economic policy mixed with foreign policy, not only in trade, but even rare earth. So, for example, if you look at the Democratic Republic of Congo and Rwanda, the DRC was very, clever of leveraging the rare earth aspect that they have to kind of entice the Americans to get much more involved, which was kind of very successful. You've seen Ukraine do it again fighting against the Russians, kind of leveraging the rare earth and kind of these minerals to entice it. And it's kind of what I would say is kind of what we're seeing in the Trump administration 2.0 is almost as like the Treasury Secretary power and influence in foreign policy decision making is equal, if not greater, than what historically has been something within the Secretary of State. Where in the past, in many aspects, trade policy and economic policy was not necessarily completely separate, but kind of secondary with an overall architecture of American foreign policy. You're seeing this being combined within the Trump administration. And I think that's a very interesting aspect. And I go back to that. I do believe that if you really want to have an understanding of where Trump's priority is, don't look at where Secretary of State Marco Rubio is going to. Look at where Secretary Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, is going to, because we're kind of seeing that. And I think that's an interesting aspect of the government involvement in a lot of the foreign policy decisions. Is kind of being framed within the construct of economic policy, specifically rare earth. My question for you is that based on everything you kind of said, it kind of makes sense the visit of Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, who everybody kind of acknowledges as the de facto ruler of Saudi Arabia. I mean, the declaration of Saudi Arabia being a major non-NATO ally by President Trump yesterday, I mean, clearly is falling within that line of this natural resources, right? This economic development and solidifying that relationship for greater geopolitical and security interests. So I'm assuming that kind of what you saw yesterday with the Saudis is something that we need to continue as a success for American foreign policy.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely you've hit right on the mark. The idea that, in terms of hierarchy, right, we've always looked to, and it's kind of been a compartmentalized kind of strategy, if you really think about it, in terms of, okay, you have the Secretary of State, and then you have the Defense Secretary, or the War Secretary, as we're calling it now. The Treasury Secretary was not a big consideration in this, right? I mean, you had the plum jobs were Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, and then Treasury was important because of global, finance, domestic and global finance policy and all that. And I think what you're seeing with Trump, which I fully support, is kind of a removing of the barriers in this conversation. So when he's having a conversation with Marco Rubio, he's got Bassett in the room, right? They're there. They're all talking. And how can we make the full power of the of the US? How can we use the use that most effectively? And Trump's a deal maker. I think bilateral agreements are going to kind of be his hallmark, and that's kind of what he's done, right? But I think at the end of the day, those individual bilateral agreements with Saudi Arabia, with Qatar, with with the various countries in Europe and in Asia and South America and whoever and wherever, they all add up, right? They all kind of develop a theme in what's being done. So he's getting committed investment coming into the U.S. They're agreeing to buy goods and services from the U.S. We're going to buy goods and services and do certain things for them. So it's using our economic power more effectively. I applaud him for that because I think it's important. But the man I look to and what, just like you said, is the Treasury Secretary, and where's he at, and what's he doing? And he kind of moves clandestinely sometimes. You don't know really what's going on there, and that's not a bad thing. So not everything's a nail, and we're not a hammer. And you can't, that's kind of been the attitude in the past, is that, well, we'll just blow it up or we'll attack it or whatever. I think what we're seeing now is a more balanced approach in terms of the type of power we're using, and I think he's leading with economic power, uh, which is a good thing in my view.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Roger Ford. You brought a lot of insight to these energy questions. I know Stefano and myself normally focus on the security aspect, but I do think that the two of these are very intertwined, and we really appreciate you joining us on the bottom line up front.
All right, thank you very much.